we're happy to have a great topic for you here tonight. This is something that we have heard about in different ways, but never in probably the depth we're going to get into tonight. So we're really excited about that. We have as our speaker tonight, Pat Bedenbaugh, who is going to take us through the history of the Newsboys of New Orleans. And Pat has been researching this for quite a number of years. It tells the story of young boys who were, among those who were trying to survive in New Orleans in the later part of the 19th century. Pat's grandfather was one of them, which we'll tell you about. And basically, it tells their history of how they were living in New Orleans, and how with the help of some of the religious orders in New Orleans, they were actually helped to survive and kind of make a living. Pat is a native of New Orleans. She graduated from Dominican and McNeese University. She became interested in genealogy when she started researching the heritage of her Irish and Sicilian grandparents. During that research, she met Sheila Larman, who was a member of GRSNO, and together they were able to start to piece together some of the history of the Newsboys and develop that. So I'll let Pat take it from there, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Nice to be here and talk about the Newsboys. I've been doing some research on these Newsboys and the Newsboys. Been doing some research on the Newsboys and the Newsboys home for probably 40 years, off and on. I started, let me say that my grandfather was a newsboy, and he's in this picture, which is just an amazing find. My mom told me years ago, after my dad had passed away, that his dad had been a newsboy and lived in a newsboy's home. So that was the first time when I ever heard that. And my father had passed away, so I didn't have anywhere to go really to find out any more about it. Later, I saw that my grandfather's obituary, John Doyle, and he said, and the obituary said that he was cast upon the streets of New Orleans at the age of 4. And that he lived in the Newsboys' home from then until he got married. So needless to say, I was like, what happened, and there's still more to learn. Let's see, I had been trying to find out, this back years ago, 1990, and I would ask people, had you ever heard the Newsboys' home? And everybody said, no, they never had. Anyway, one day I was taking a bus tour of the Irish Channel. We were going to St. Alphonsus Church, and I asked the person next to me on the bus, I said, you ever heard of the Newsboys' home? She said, no. She said, but ask Sheila Larman. And from then on, I asked Sheila Larman a lot. But anyway, we got off the bus, we went into to St. Alphonsus, and in the back of the church, there was a museum. And I walked into the museum, and they had a big glass case, and in the middle of that glass case was this picture, and that's how I found that picture. And it's sort of like a genealogy miracle to me, when you're looking for something, and all of a sudden it's just right there. So anyway, I met George Gresh. He ran the museum, that's Sheila Larman, and from then on, I've been doing some research on the home and on the boys who lived there. So sort of like I wanted to find out more about the home and about the boys there. So the newspapers of today, there were about 30 of them. There were about 30 newspapers. And here are some of them. But there were German papers, French papers. There were, let's see, there was Catholic newspapers. There were dailies, there were weeklies, there were black-owned newspapers. So the newspapers pretty much had a lot of power during that time, and a lot of people working for them. And some of those people were about 300 newsboys who were working on the streets of New Orleans during that time. Let's see. So here's my grandfather, and I found out that he had a brother, and I think that's his brother. This John Thomas Doyle and William Joseph Doyle, who was a year younger. During that time, let's see, okay. The fascinating thing about the Newsboys in New Orleans is that between 1879, this is when they started, 1879 to 1915, they had guardian angels. They had Sisters of Mercy, they had St. Vincent de Paul Society, they had Jesuit priests, and they had a lot of people in the community that came together during these years to provide a home for the boys and education for the boys. They were not getting an education, and a place for them to be safe. So that's the Newsboys' home. There's the Picayune building that's on Camp Street. It's called Newspaper Row. And you see it in the drawing, all those little boys in the front, those are newsboys. So I don't know how long ago it was drawn, but those are newsboys. The little newsboy sleeping in the alley. And right here is Bank Alley. So Bank Alley was where the newsboys went to pick up their newspapers every day. They slept in the alley. And when the nuns started putting together a home for them, the first home they had was in the entered from the alleyway. So that's how they started. That first home in 1879 until 1890 was on Bank Alley, and it's where my grandfather and his uncle lived until they were adults. So that was the first home. Let's see. Okay. There was a Times Democrat article in the newspaper that described the first home. And it said the home has a chapel, a club room, a dormitory, a kitchen, a dining hall, and a schoolroom. The boys congregated every day in the club room when they're not occupied in selling papers or with their classes. They amuse themselves by playing games and reading books. Those who have no homes are allowed to stay and sleep in the home. Those that have a home, then they go home at night. That home provided food, provided a place for them to sleep, place for them to study. And since the boys liked to sing, the nuns got an organ for them. So that was, you'll see that all along. These boys love to sing, they love to write music, they love to entertain. So during that time, there were over 300 newsboys alone. There were news carriers. There were people who did work in the newspaper business. It's very, very powerful. We could compare the power of the press then to the power of television and now the internet today. So lots of people worked for the newspapers. So the Sisters of Mercy. The Sisters of Mercy came into New Orleans in 1869. 6 of them came. I'm going to name them. Mother Mary Catherine Grant, Mother Mary Austin Carroll of County Tipperary, and she was a power to be reckoned with. Mary Xavier McDermott, Frances O'Farrell, Mary Camillus Lucas, and Eliza Shields. They were the first ones to come into New Orleans. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to just make a comment about that. They came in 1869, so just a very few years after the end of the Civil War. And they came into a mess. There was poverty, there was disease, the yellow fever was rampant. There were a lot of people that were dying. a lot of Civil War widows, a lot of people who came from the Civil War, you know, that couldn't work, that had lost limbs, things like that. So the widows were not prepared to support their families. The nuns had opened orphanages and half orphanages for the people in New Orleans. Mother Austin Carroll was instrumental in getting a Newsboys home up and running. Let's see, the sisters also began recruiting young women to join the sisterhood. And before long, there were 30 young women who were studying to be nuns during that time. Okay, during the 1870s, the sisters established daycare centers, orphanages. They taught school, they added libraries to their schools, they visited prisons, they did job training for widows, they did child care, and they taught school during the day, and some of them taught the Newsboys at night. Sister Benedicta Eliza Shields, she came into New Orleans a year before, and Sister Mary Xavier came in with that first 6 sisters. They died a year later of yellow fever. So 2 of 6 of the sisters coming to New Orleans died. I just put this in here just for some names. These were the names of the children, the young men and one young girl who were listed as newsboys in the 1880 census. The 1880 census did not have the Newsboys home as an address. And so these boys and the young girl were just in the regular census listed as their occupation being a news person or a news carrier. I put the ones in here that were 18 or younger. They probably didn't live in the Newsboys home, maybe a few of them did, but you can see down here, volume 2, John Doyle and William Doyle. So that's my grandfather and his brother. And they were listed as newsboys. They were listed as living with his mother, who lived on, I think, Annunciation Street. But I think that they were living at this time in the Newsboys home. And I just don't know why. I don't know what happened to their mother. But I think that they were helping support their mother during this time. And their father had passed away. Christmas Day. Christmas Day was their only day off. Other than that, they sold papers every day. It's hard to believe. This is the time when you can find something in a newspaper about boys and about the home. So once you start doing some research in the newspapers, you know, Christmas Day was a big one because they had events, they had people come to visit them. There was food, the boys got gifts, and it was quite an occasion. So we first see the name Sister Mary Herminia here. Sister Mary Philomene here, and Mrs. Kelly. She took care of the home. She kept it clean. Sister Philomene was another force of nature, like Mother Carol. She was always busy. I don't know how they did it. But we first see her name here. They say 100 to 250 boys came during Christmas to eat and to celebrate. And the one time of the year they got gifts. Oh, there was one. Okay, the next one. So this is again the same picture, but this was the one thing I found in one of the papers that they gave medals to the boys. So here we see this group of boys. This must have been around 1882 to 1884. Would have been in the news home, you know, the Newsboys home at that time. And then here are names of boys. So I can't put too many names together, but of all the names we've got down here, 3rd class medal, John Doyle, and a 4th class medal, William Doyle. So we know they were in the home, we know they were doing well, they were trying. And the paper December 25th, 1884, said the Newsboys Home is one of the best managed institutions in the city. Okay, we get into 1890 now. This is when they built the new Newsboys Home. It was on 90 Barefoot Street, and it was a 4-story building. It was the old Planters Hotel, so it was a hotel in the beginning. It had 30 rooms. Can you imagine cleaning it? All the boys running around. It had a chapel for 200 people, a gymnasium, 5 classrooms, and 3 finished dormitories. So it was a big, very large home. This is the picture of their chapel and the outside of the home. This is when Father Porter comes into the picture. He wrote a booklet, wrote a little book called An Account of the Newsboys Home. He wrote it in 1992, something like that. And I found it in the archives, the Loyola archives, many years ago, and it gave such an amazing picture of the time and who the boys were and who the people were in the home. So his account of a newsboys home in New Orleans, it describes a priest, turns out to be himself, running into a newsboy on Canal Street and starting a conversation. So Father Porta said, I happened one day to be walking down Canal Street when I heard a clear piping voice shouting, evening piper, all about the moida. With the intention of buying the paper, I turned around and beckoned to the owner of the high-pitched voice, a hatless, shoeless, one-suspended little midget of a boy. He ran up and in the most apologetic tone, he said, excuse me, father, there ain't been no moida. I wasn't hollering for you, father. I wouldn't fool no priest for nothing, me. So Father Porter says, and why do you holler murder? He says, oh, I'm dead sure, Father, there's been a murder somewhere, somewhere in this paper. So he said, I wouldn't fool no priest for nothing. Here, Father, take a paper for nothing. So priest says, how do you know I'm a priest? And he says, oh, that's easy. Voice, I can tell by your collar, then your face, then your clothes. And you see, Father, I live in a newsboys home. And lots of priests come around. I can tell a bishop too. So he said, who's in charge of the home? He says, sisters, Father, and I can tell you, there's the best women in New Orleans, even if they don't take no fooling from us. There's only 4 of them, but there's worse than 20 cops when they get mad. They're not always nice. So he asked Father to come visit his home. Life at their new home. The sisters show Father Porter around. I believe, said one of the sisters, that each newsboy has a guardian angel, one for the body and the other for the soul. And here's the daily schedule of that home. 7 a.m. rising, except Sunday when they get up at 2 a.m. to sell the morning paper. 7:30, breakfast with mountains of bread and butter engulfed and rivers of black coffee. They drink coffee all day, I think. 8 a.m., washing up after breakfast, getting dressed, and younger boys leaving for parochial school, taught by the Newsboys sisters until 11:30. The older boys, I think, just went out selling papers. 12 noon, dinner of 2 dishes of meat, 2 vegetables, and a dessert. 1 o'clock, the boys go to Bank Alley to wait for the 2 o'clock edition of the paper. 7:30 p.m., home sweet home, except Fridays, when they sell some weeklies until midnight. When they return home, they have to clean up, a concession to the bedclothes. Most of them attend night school. They do. Yeah. The state had a huge event in 1894. It was a Newsboys Festival. It lasted for 2 days. 30,000 people attended. The drawings in the newspaper were just amazing. You see the Picayune tent. There were people, every group of every paper, everybody in the city were selling food, were selling drinks, candies, cookies. The boys were performing. There were basketball, baseball games, mule cart races, fortune telling, music, a lot of costumes. There were fireworks. During the opening ceremonies, Mayor Fitzpatrick at the time gave a rousing speech about boys. And Father Gaffney, first time we heard Father Gaffney, but he was the chaplain during this time. A chorus of 200 newsboys performed its rendition of Newsboys on the Street. So this was a big event. I think it made about $20,000. So I think it paid off most of the debt of the Newsboys home. Some of the costumes that were in the paper, about 2 or 3 pages of information. It goes on and on, but some of the costumes were really interesting. So now we've got the Newsboys, Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band. They became really famous. They sang for everything that the Newsboys home had. So when the bishop came to visit, they sang and performed. When there was Christmas, they performed. You couldn't keep them from performing. And this is, I love the middle picture because you see the band there. They all have handmade instruments. And they're playing in Storyville. I know. So they did that all the time. So they're down in Storyville at night playing. They go into school. They're selling papers during the day. They're going to classes at night. Then after that, they're going to Storyville to perform. So you see Razzie Dazzy, Spasm Band, amazing feats on homemade guitars, led by Emile Stalebread Lacombe. And he became very, very famous. He was very famous throughout his life in New Orleans. He continued to play in bands and be the leader of bands. The members of his band, I wanted to name them, I just love them. Emile Stalebread was his name. Lacombe, Harry Gregson, Emile Whiskey Benrod, Willie Cajun Busey, Frank Monk Busey, Slewfoot Pete, Anthony Warm Gravy Brett Bagel, Zuzu, and a singer named Tommy, also known as Family Haircut. So that was the first Spasm band, and it was very much like a jazz band. And here he is as an older man, and here he is playing the guitar. Here's the band in the beginning. The little fella sitting down with a zither, the second from the left, that's Emile. So that's him as a kid. He was always the leader of the bands. He was blind by the age of 15. But he continued playing the banjo, the zither, the guitar, and the piano in New Orleans until the 30s. He died in 1946. He was 61 years old. He's buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery No. 1, and his tomb bears the inscription placed there by his daughter to the effect that he was the originator of jazz. Oh. Okay, these are just the two, here in the back, the two census, the Newsboys census. So then this, in 1900, we find the Newsboys on the census, in the census. So they've got the staff, Mother Mary Scholastica, the head, Sister Mary Frederica, so they've listed the people who are teachers there who are taking care of the home, and they list and the people who are taking care of, the property, things like that. And then they list the newsboys. So you see that the first time they're all together in one place and who they are. That's the 1990 census. And the 1910 census, same thing. You see the staff, the sisters, and the inmates. I think many times they call the boys inmates, and they call the home an asylum. So this is Father Porta. We talked about him before when he was the priest that came along and talked to the little newsboy. He was the newsboy's chaplain for 13 years after that, and he was called the Pope. He was a professor of metaphysics and ethics at Loyola University. He spoke for the poor and labor class, often quoting Pope Leo XIII's encyclical on labor and capital. A little bit they talked about was interesting. And for the little and big newsboys, he was known as the one to make things right. So the newsboys always were depending on Father Porta. In his obituary, he was born in France in 1860 of Spanish parents. He entered the Society of Jesus. He was a Jesuit in 1877. He made his novitiate at Grand Coteau in Louisiana. His obituary said he was one of the most brilliant scholars of the renowned Jesuit order. Introduced him, newsboys came to him to introduce their girlfriends to him when they wanted to get married. He was present at their Christmas and Easter celebrations, their marriages, and he wrote sadly of a newsboy's funeral. He said of the newsboy is a hard worker, beginning his labors hours before dawn until after dark when the last evening paper is disposed of. He's bright beyond his years. The newsboy is a child with a man's trials and with experiences that make him a philosopher. These are people who made a difference. Mother Austin Carroll, the first person up there, and she was a tireless worker. She came into New Orleans in 1869, and from the moment she stepped off the boat, she was working. Sounds like that was her lot in life. She wasn't approved by the Archbishop to be Mother Superior, even though the Mercy nuns had voted her that. So she was having some major battles with the Archbishop in New Orleans, trying to get her due, and she did, but she was always having to fight for things, for the Irish Channel and for the newsboys. Mother Philomene, that's the picture, the next picture. You saw her, she was the newsboys, the head of the newsboys home for at least 15 years. Let's see. Okay, right here is Father Gaffney, and he was the chaplain for the newsboys home for a number of years. Then Father Porta, the Pope, he again was chaplain for about 15 years for the newsboys. Some of the others here, Miss Marie Denaire and Miss Ruth Hudson. Miss Marie Denaire, she was very wealthy, and she was always doing fundraising and giving money for the newsboys and for the home and for hospitals, for children, anything for children. Miss Ruth Harrison, she was a singer, and she was always having concerts. So you see in the paper a concert for the newsboys. You've got Father Porta here, you've got Father Gaffney, you've got Father Alphonsus Dufour and Father William Tyrell, and they too were chaplains for a while. The St. Vincent de Paul Society, Mr. Thomas Rapier, Mr. John Green, Mr. P. Finney, Mr. Graham, Mr. McCaffrey. There were lots of them, but these were the heads, and they were raising money to keep the Newsboys home open. You've got Henry McHenry and John Markey, festival chairman of the Newsboys Festival. Got Dr. Sullivan, J.J. McGinty. Reception committees, for the reception committee, Hugh DeBordes, Joseph Bromhurst, G.A. Hassinger, F.S. Bostic, Mr. Charles McCrae. There's all names that I recognize, through the years. And then at the bottom, I just put this in, Rose McGinnis. She was a St. Vincent orphan asylum girl of 4 who knew all the Newsboys' names by heart that were in the home. Some people we know. Some donations listed in 1914. Theo Abbey Meads, that was a Irish channel. A lot of Irish channel people will give in donations during this time. American Education Society books, Beekman always gave clothes to the Newsboys. And so you see this, one of the first times I've seen his name is giving clothes to the Newsboys. Consumer Biscuit Company, cakes, El Favre, building repairs, SM Usage, oysters, Ruth Harrison, concert, Joe and Sons Coal, Joseph Myers, sacks and potatoes, August Boucher, bread, John Sharp, electrical work, and United Fruit, bunches of bananas. That's it. So the last days of the Newsboys' home, now we're in 1914. The Newsboys' home was doing well until it was like about 1910 or so, 1910, 1912. And during that time, before that time, it looked like the people that really were taking care of it started getting really old. They started dying, started losing them. And there was really nobody that came along that could do the work that they did. So times were changing. Father Kellogg, he was head of the home then. Can you all hear that? What? It sounded like a phone. No, turn it off. Oh, okay. Dr. Kellogg, he was the head of the home at that time. And he started asking for money to keep the home going. And so the list you have back here of all the donors, that was at the sort of at the end when the Newsboys home was getting into disrepair and there were child labor laws, rightfully so, came along. They didn't want these boys working like that, and so it was harder and harder. But it was interesting. In 1915, they named the Newsboys' home the Catholic Protectory for Boys, a manual training school for orphaned, neglected, and wayward boys. That wasn't going to work. Didn't seem like a good idea. But the home closed after that. These are some, just some little comments. I think we have time. In the beginning, 1877, a newsboy quoted in the newspaper, "The cops are not sharp or agile enough to catch burglars or murderers, but let some poor newsboys go in the back alley to play a sociable private game of dice and see how quick they snatch us up." In 1879, university sisters were reported to the Vatican for consorting with ruffians on the streets of New Orleans. So they didn't want them going down there to teach them at night. They weren't allowed out at night. In 1881, Newsboys wrote a heartwarming address to Mother Mary Teresa Austin on the occasion of her silver anniversary. They said, "Perhaps someday when we are men, our lives will praise and bless you louder than any tongue can do." She called her newsboys junior members of the press. She didn't like that street waifs and vagabonds. 1909, Mrs. Marie Turner Kelly, known as Mother Kelly, passed away at the age of 60. Mrs. Kelly accomplished wonders with the urchins of the street, providing the newsboys with all the comforts at home in the Newsboys' home. 1912, Father Joseph Meehan, who grew up in the Newsboys' home, returned to say his first mass in their chapel. 1915, Mother Philomene passed away to her reward. She was beloved as the good angel of homeless newsboys. These are cute. 1930, Bernard Cunningham, he was running for assessor in New Orleans, and he was accused by his opponent of living in a newsboy's home. I did live in the newsboy's home, he said. I did sell papers on the streets of New Orleans. The good sisters taught me the principles of correct behavior toward my fellow man and my duties to God. He won. In 1949, sellers of papers for 67 years died. Edward Birmingham, 67 years old, was a newspaper salesman, started selling the old New Orleans Times at the age of 8. Mr. Birmingham was the organizer of the Newsboys Benevolent Association. 1956, James Arthus. Christmas Day 47 years ago, I happened to be one of 35 inmates at the old Newsboys home on Marone Street. We paid 20 cents a day for 2 meals and all we could eat in our own church, dormitory, mess hall, and gymnasium. We had night school 3 nights a week. Okay, here we go. A tale of 2 brothers. Both boys were newsboys. Both lived in a newsboys' home. Both received medals at their 1884 Christmas dinner for attendance and good conduct. Their father died when John was 1, but before William was born. Their mother's occupation was listed in the 1880 census as a huckster, most likely selling fruit on the corner. For John's obituary, well-known New Orleans, following the well-known news carrier is dead. Following an extraordinary life, which led from the time he was away seeking a haven in the newsboy's home to the period when he became the father of 11 children and owner of a palatial home on Louisiana Avenue, John Doyle, a widely known news dealer, has died. He was born in New Orleans in 1867, and at the age of 4, he was cast upon the streets. He lived in the newsboy's home until he was married. As the daily item grew, he grew and prospered. He was a good husband and father, a thrifty, industrious citizen, a generous and in his acts. John Doyle died from pneumonia, recuperating from a broken back. He broke his back lifting bales of hay to feed his horses. William Joseph Doyle was a newsboy. He lived in the newsboy's home until he moved with his brother John to an apartment on Toy Fry Street. He was listed as a musician in the city directory. He died an alcoholic at the age of 29. His father, William Joseph, met the same fate in 1868, a few months before William was born. The Newsboys Benevolent Association, you see the name Mr. Edward Birmingham, he established the association and was the treasurer of the association. And Mr. Sidney Roth paid for eventual care of the grave site. And you see the names buried in the Newsboys' grave in Greenwood Cemetery. Okay, times are changing. Tulane University student thesis, and Ben Kaplan, his thesis, talked about the Newsboys, and rightfully so, you know, how there were no child protection laws, how the newspapers were so powerful during the time that he even talks about the fact that he is indicating that the power of the press was instrumental in not having stronger child labor laws in New Orleans at that time. So the Newsboys, his thesis talked about the problems, with newsboys, and that they needed more protection, which they did. So, let's see. So I don't want to leave it at that. Here are the places and the people that made a difference in the lives of so many of the newsboys. So I have a story to read to you. There are too many people of these people who work too hard, so I want to tell you a good story. This was an article in the Picayune of the Newsboys Christmas Party in 1910. And it says, Christmas was still the main event of the year at the Newsboys' home. Reverend Mother Philomene had fallen and was still recuperating. She wasn't able to attend. In every other detail, the Christmas celebration was perfect. Christmas carols were sung by boyish newsboys' voices. Reverend Father Porta said 3 masses at the chapel, and the chapel was a dream of beauty in its Christmas decorations with a brand new crib Father Porter arranged with his own hands. Grace was said promptly at noon, and the first meal was served. Prior to the dinner, a special treat was given by Mr. Ben Beekman, who provided clothing for the boys. Mr. Sam Stern carved the turkey. The Newsboys Orchestra, under the direction of Emile Lacombe, was singing the barbershop rag. Happy Slew, preacher, Frenchy Fay, and his young son and daughter were in attendance. All the old boys were there. It was through the courtesy of one of them, Thomas Locke, that the beautiful Christmas hymns were printed in leaflet form. John Cicciarello, a one-armed Italian, did all the decorating of the banquet hall. The boys themselves painted all of the walls. A one-legged newsboy did all of the scrubbing of the halls and stairs. The feast served was worthy of a prince.
Maybe some questions.
Yes, they want to.
We have some time for questions. If you all would like to just raise your hand and ask a question.
Did y'all recognize any names?
You have, if you want.
Did y'all recognize any names? New Orleans names?
Yeah, there are a lot of them.
Yeah, I know. I couldn't, you just read it. It's like, oh, their
That's what.
kids are walking around. Their great-great-grandkids are walking the streets of New Orleans.
Great-great-grandfather was even,
Oh, what was his name?
his name was Dennis Casey.
Casey? Did he live in the home at all, or did he?
Brothers.
3 brothers. That was something when you see the census, there were 2 or 3 brothers. There were Hinkle brothers in one. There were a lot of brothers that were newsboys.
I think the internet now is taking over.
Yes, yeah. Well, the internet, these boys were smart. They were smart. They knew what they were doing. They were cagey. And they knew how to get the word out. I think that's why there were so many articles in the paper that had something to do with the newsboys, probably because they knew how to get it in the paper. Where is Greenwood?
Where's the marker?
Oh, yeah, it's in the middle. I don't know quite where it is, but it's, did you see the picture of it? Yeah. Yeah, and it's in the middle. My grandfather is over to the right on the Canal Boulevard side, and the Greenwood is right, right in the middle to the right.
Your research, did you Did you find out any of the occupations that some of them had later in life? Because they got to be adults.
Well, a lot of them, what I saw, they say newsmen, they say news carriers. They went on to, to make a good living doing that. I didn't see band members, you saw a lot of band members. And that's all, I haven't seen anything else. Oh, yeah, politicians. A number of politicians started out as newsboys, they know how to get things done, smart kids. I'm sure the ones that weren't so smart just fell by the wayside, can't do that all day and half the night.
Did the boys buy the newspapers, and carry, did they buy the newspapers and then take them out to sell them?
I think they bought the newspapers, I think they did, I don't think they were I don't think the newspapers would give these boys the paper. I think they were gonna come back with any money.
And the areas that they chose, I imagine it was turf wars or?
Yes, yes, there were turf wars. They wanted to be on Canal Street. They wanted to be on St. Charles Avenue. They wanted to be they called it something like the grand thoroughfares. They wanted to go on St. Charles Avenue, and so there were fights about that. Yeah, definitely. Mhm.
So what happened to all these boys' parents? They had just died?
I think because it was so close after the Civil War, a lot of the men were either injured or had died, been killed. I think there was probably a lot of alcoholism, during that time too. And it looked like the ones that were newsboys, it looked like they had people to support. They were taken care of, or they had younger brothers and sisters, things like that. And then my grandfather, boy, I found hardly nothing about his mom, except that one census, and she was a huckster. And like I say, I looked it up, and it's somebody that probably sells fruit or pencils or something. Sounds depressing. Uh-huh.
So, just last month in October, I toured the Storyville Museum that's on Rampart,
Uh-huh.
which I highly recommend by the way. It's been a good hour and a half, 2 hours there. And so they talked about all the bands and everything, but I don't recall seeing anything about the newsboys. If you reached out to them, I bet they would love to add a small little exhibit about the newsboys there.
I bet they would. Thank you. And Camille McComb, he made a name for himself too. So I'd love to hear some of it. I can't imagine what it sounded like, but there must be something, somewhere that has a little bit of this music. Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody.